At the end of the day, you really need to prioritize you, your happiness, your health, and your relationship with food and training. Because as soon as something becomes obsessive, and as soon as something starts taking away from your life and therefore hindering your life and not enhancing your life, something needs to change. Well, we've got a bloody interesting video today because I'm actually going to talk about something I haven't really spoken about on this channel before. Doing so will hopefully provide some educational tips and tricks for you to then potentially apply to yourself, which will hopefully help you achieve whatever goals you may have. And that is kind of the concept of bulking, cutting, and like gaining, or maybe even maintaining as well. And this is something that's been requested for a long time, but something I never actually addressed, and that's exactly what we're going to do today, because this video was sent to me, How I Lost Fat and Gained Lean Mass, My Simple Approach by GainsByBrains, and that's kind of like triggered this conversation and triggered this thought saying, you know what, let's discuss this. Obviously, before we crack on with the video, we're going to do the bits and bobs that very quickly need to be done. If at any point throughout this entire video you feel like you've learned something, or maybe even just enjoyed the video and maybe even enjoyed me, then please do consider liking the video, as the goal for this video is 1,300 likes. And if you haven't already, please do consider clicking the red button down below to subscribe to the channel, and maybe even clicking the bell next to it so you get notified when I upload every week, twice a week. And if you have a question you want me to answer at the end of the next video, then please do consider dropping it down below in the comment section for the comment question of the week, and I shall do so. I've had today. It was a bloody nightmare to sort out because I had to blow it up. And when I did blow it up, I kept deflating, and now it doesn't even fit on my head. I'm going to be honest with you, I've forced that in aggressively and it's way too tight. I can't feel my face. It's kind of cool. It's a bit big though. The last hat was a bit flaccid. This one's maybe well too erect. I can't keep up. I can't do it. So the majority of this video actually discusses the kind of journey towards GainsByBrains developing her app and all those bits and bobs, which is really cool. The peak area of interest is about the halfway point, in which it kind of discusses what's relevant to the title, and that's where we're going to skip to save you watching too much content you don't need to watch.
So after assessing my goals, then it's time for me to go into whatever I'm currently doing at my maintaining phase, and then I try to tweak the different variables. So for example, if my goal is to gain, then I can tweak my intake.
We'll have a BMR, basal metabolic rate, and that essentially determines how many calories you burn at rest. Then once you factor into your just general activity as you go about your daily life, you can then determine what your maintenance calories are. And that essentially refers to the number of calories, or the amount of calories I should say, you have to consume on a daily basis to maintain your body weight. It could be 1,000 or something, it could be 5,000 or something, who knows, it really does depend on the person. There is such a range it could be. But essentially what it does refer to is what's your baseline, and that's what we kind of consider it. But then you kind of flip into two other areas and you look at bulking and cutting. So bulking typically refers to like a calorie surplus, in which you will eat a bit more food, so let's say 200 calories above your maintenance calories, in order to slowly gain weight, with in most cases the desire to increase the amount of muscle mass you can gain during that period. And then you have the other end of the spectrum, which is a deficit, being cutting essentially, where let's say you maybe go 200 calories under your maintenance, in which you would slowly lose weight, with the desire there in a lot of cases to maintain muscle mass whilst also losing a bit of body fat. What you pick and choose to do is very much based on your goals and what you're trying to achieve. But there are a few misconceptions with it, in the sense that, and this is something I will hold my hands up and admit, is that I did believe this for a while until I read more science about it, is that the misconception is you cannot gain muscle mass in a deficit, or you have to be in a surplus, so consume more calories than you expend, to gain muscle mass. And that's not the case. And that's essentially due to the fact that the development of muscle mass, so building muscle tissue, is a signal-driven process, not a food-driven process. To develop muscle mass, we must do something to encourage that muscle to grow, essentially. And that usually falls into the realm of like progressive overload. When we resistance train, we do more. We lift a bit heavier, we do more reps, something along those lines. And that's what I mean by it's signal-driven. So the signal that is driving the development of muscle mass is going to be that progressive overload. So resistance training and doing more. So you can eat as much as you want, but if you're not driving the signals required and necessary for developing muscle mass, such as, like I said, progressive overload, which then falls into the realm of like mechanical tension, so training to, if not close to failure, all those bits and bobs, then food aside, you're not going to gain muscle mass. Flip around, if you're eating so little that you don't have the energy to drive those signals, you're also not going to gain muscle mass. So again, it's about what can you do to enhance how likely you are to drive that signal that's then going to translate to the development of muscle mass. And like I said, that signal that's going to drive the growth of muscle is going to be largely mechanical tension, which again is then further supported by progressive overload. And mechanical tension is almost like the reason for your muscles to grow. And that largely stems from your training intensity. So the amount of effort you're putting into each working set that you are doing when you're training muscle groups. Once you are able to do so, you yield enough mechanical tension to then grow muscle. But then in order to maintain that mechanical tension, we must progressively overload. So when you go to the gym every time you're able to, which likely won't be every week, but you can try, do an extra rep, do an extra bit of weight, something along those lines. So that's our signal driving hypertrophy, the development of muscle. Okay, well, what can we do to achieve that signal? Like I said, food will not drive that signal. But what food does do is food helps you drive that signal, in the sense that it gives you that energy surplus to then better allow you to train harder, to then better allow you to progressively overload. So although you can certainly progressively overload whether you're in a deficit, a maintenance phase, or a bulking phase, it is typically easier to do so when you're in a bulking phase because you have that surplus of energy which you can then use to help drive your training intensity and performance to then maintain sufficient mechanical tension through progressive overload. So immediately we've now figured out from like a calorie perspective what you need to do to gain muscle mass.
And then if my goal is to gain, then I obviously need to make sure that I either eat more or move less. For me, I feel better when I eat more instead of moving less, because I think that helps me with living a healthier lifestyle. So therefore I decide to improve my food qualities and increase the quantity of what I'm eating.
You don't necessarily need to increase calorie intake to be in a surplus. You can decrease expenditure. So essentially you don't have to eat more, you can just move less. But again, I'd very much align with GainsByBrains here in the sense that I'd rather not move less. If you are eating like mass amounts of food to gain weight, then I understand that you may want to cut back your daily steps to just make it a bit easier to an extent. But I wouldn't want to essentially live an inactive lifestyle minus resistance training just for the sake of trying to gain a bit of weight. I'd rather just eat a bit more. But again, that's preference. You don't have to do either. It's just personally, I think we both align here that we would rather eat more rather than move less. And I think many of you would probably say the same.
And the reason why I love it this way is because it doesn't require me to track. So I think that in order for you to be able to make it part of your life, it needs to be something that you can do automatically. So whenever it requires you a lot of your attention, it automatically means that it's not really something that you do out of a habit.
Another fair point is you don't need to track calories, macros, whatever it may be, if you don't want to. But I will say, typically when you are fully aware of the numbers, it might be a bit easier to achieve the goals if you are tracking it because you have more data points to work with. It's not necessary. It just may allow you to achieve your goals a bit faster. Let's say you did want to track calories. How do you approach it? I always say try and find your maintenance first. Because once you know your maintenance, your baseline, you can go up and down depending on what your goals suggest. And you can do that through like a TDEE calculator online to give you a rough idea. Then you could eat at that number for a couple of weeks and then monitor your body weight from there. If you want to track your scale weight, again, you don't need to. You can go based on looks. But again, for this case, when we're looking at, let's say, optimizing building of muscle, we want as much data to work with as possible so we can tell the full story. Once you've got your maintenance, you then consider either eating at maintenance, eating a bit less, so maybe let's say 200 calories under or so, to be in a deficit to potentially lose some body fat, or maybe eating a bit more to be in a surplus to then potentially gain some weight, which could hopefully lead to or result in additional muscle mass gained. There is a finite amount of muscle we can gain per year. And how much muscle you can gain per year, it really does depend on you, your genetics, how long you've been training, so many factors. But there is almost an infinite amount of fat we can gain per year, which is why personally, if you are going to go down the kind of bulking approach, if you want to call it that, so like a calorie surplus approach, you don't need to gain mass amounts of weight to do so if you don't want to. Because if you gain, let's say, 20 pounds, and let's say 5 pounds of that is muscle in a year, and 15 pounds of that is fat, well, what if you could also gain that same 5 pounds of muscle, but maybe with less fat? So it's about finding a good steady rate that you are happy with. And I'm fully aware that this concept doesn't apply to a lot of people because many of you probably don't want to go down the bulking cutty approach. And again, I don't think you need to. You can gain, for a lack of a better term, which is eat at maintenance and gain muscle at the same time. Just ensure your training intensity is there and also ensure that your protein intake is sufficient. When it comes down to building muscle, the big things we typically want to look at, from the food perspective anyway, are going to be calories and protein intake. Like I said, calories I've explained before, easier to drive that signal if you have more calories per play with, but not necessary. Protein is obviously the macronutrient that's most important when it comes to building muscle. Therefore, you should typically eat enough protein to drive that muscle building process. And for most people, a kind of steady rule of thumb that a lot of people follow is roughly about a gram of protein per pound of body weight. And we also know that 1 gram of protein is about 4 calories. So times your protein intake by 4, so let's say 200 by 4 is 800, that's 800 calories worth of protein, which you can then take away from whatever calories you're on, so let's say your maintenance of 2000, you then have 1200 calories to play with, which you can eat whatever in the sense of like carbs, fat, you can eat however many you want if you want to, or you can maybe isolate that to saying I want to eat a certain set amount of fat and a certain set amount of carbs. How you dictate that is completely up to you. But again, you don't need to track macros, you don't need to track calories, you don't need to do any of those things. You don't need to track your calories to eat enough calories. You essentially just have to either eat a bit more or maybe even move a bit less depending on what you want to do. It really does depend on you, what makes you happy, and your goals.
Whereas if I don't feel the need to track, but I still know that I'm working towards my goals, I don't have that mental capacity dedicated to the gym, and I can use that for something else. And that way the gym enhances your life and it doesn't become your life.
It kind of very much goes to the point which I always speak about, is that the gym and the realm of fitness is meant to enhance your life, not hinder your life. I really like tracking calories, I love numbers, I'm a bit of a loser as we know. But so many of you don't. Be that because you live stressful lifestyles, be that because you just don't really want to track calories, or maybe potentially due to your relationship with food, with calories, with training, and doing so is not healthy for you, which I completely understand, I think is very valid. So ultimately it comes down to the fact of you do not need to do anything that you don't want to do. If you want to track calories, you can track calories, but do you need to track calories? Absolutely not. Will it potentially make the process of achieving your goals a bit easier because you have more data to work with? Potentially, yes, but is it necessary? No chance. Do you need to track your macros, your protein, your carbs, your fats? Absolutely not. Will it again potentially achieve your goals a little bit easier? Potentially, because again you have more data to work with, but it's by no means necessary. There are so many other ways you can approach it. If you don't want to track anything, you can just eat how you want. I fully respect it, you do that. Sometimes if you're like, you know what, I feel like I want to accelerate the process of gaining a bit more, then maybe you can just eat slightly bigger portions, or maybe you say I want to actually lose a bit more body fat. Maybe you could do some extra steps and move a bit more. Maybe you could eat a slightly smaller portion. You can also measure portions using like your palm, so that's like a palm of fats, a fist of protein, something along those lines, as like an easy way to kind of maybe have a better idea of how much you're eating, but not in the sense that you have to track anything with numbers. Again, there are so many ways to approach it. The big thing you have to remember is you need to identify what your goals are. Once you identify what your goals are, and your goal could be something like building muscle, your goal could be losing fat, your goal could just be enjoying training. And once you've identified that goal, you can then figure out what you need to do to achieve that goal. So if you want to build muscle, we already know, make sure you're training hard, make sure you're training well, make sure you're recovering enough, and make sure you're eating enough. And again, that enough doesn't need to be a surplus. That enough just needs to be enough for you to make progress in the gym. If your goal is to have fun, then do workouts that you enjoy. Doesn't matter if they're optimal, doesn't matter if they're the best workouts in the world, doesn't matter if they're not very effective movements. Do the workouts you enjoy. Again, it all comes down to doing what's best for you, But now hopefully from this video you can take away that no, you don't need to be in a surplus to gain muscle mass. You can gain muscle mass in a maintenance phase. You can even gain it in a deficit if you're able to drive sufficient mechanical tension through progressive overload, therefore training hard enough and progressing in the gym, but extra calories may help you doing so. Do you need to track those calories to get there? Absolutely not. But doing so, again, may help you, but it's by no means necessary. At the end of the day, you really need to prioritize you, your happiness, your health, and your relationship with food and training. Because as soon as something becomes obsessive, and as soon as something starts taking away from your life, and therefore hindering your life and not enhancing your life, something needs to change. Because that is probably not going to be sustainable. And if it's not sustainable, then is it something we really want to invest all our energy into? When we can maybe invest our energy into a more sustainable approach that enhances every other aspect of your life, instead of leaves you feeling guilty, leaves you feeling obsessed with numbers, your scale weight, your calorie numbers, and leaves you feeling almost trapped inside a box where everything you do in life is dictated by numbers, which we know is not a healthy approach, and it's not a necessary approach either. There are always ways around it, and if you're struggling with anything, be that food related, be that progression in the gym, be that anything related to anything I'm talking about today, then please don't hesitate to reach out and contact me, because as you know, my DMs are always open. Hopefully you've managed to take something from this video, and hopefully I've managed to provide a lesson. Thanks to GainsByBrains for releasing this video, which has created that catalyst for conversation and that catalyst for education that will hopefully benefit at least some of you. Just remember, you do not need to do anything you don't want to do, and just because somebody online says you do, doesn't necessarily mean it's true. Your happiness is a priority, and so is your health. But now we're very quickly going to crack on with the comment question of the week. For those of us who work out at home, what type of exercises would be effective for abs? Also, what do you think about ab rollers? So essentially, it depends like what kind of effective you're looking for. So if you're, let's say, looking at like building the abs like you would build any other muscle, then it really is anything that takes those abs through a sufficient range of motion against resistance. And I'm a big fan of crunch variations because again, you're reducing the distance between your sternum and your pelvis, or like a reverse crunch variation, which are reducing the distance between your pelvis and your sternum. That way you could potentially place a bit more emphasis on either the upper or lower ab divisions, depending on what you're choosing to do. But beyond that, if you have other goals that aren't necessarily related to like ab hypertrophy, then you can look at like plank variations, side plank variations, Copenhagen planks. You've also got rotational movements like Russian twists, I think are fine with dumbbells if you have access to one, or maybe even bands. If you have bands, you can then do Russian twists with a band, just put it in the door. You can also do Pallof press. There are so many variations of things you can do. Ab rollers, again, not something I use personally because they don't necessarily align with my goals, but I feel like for the development of abs through a hypertrophy standpoint, probably not the best because you're not really taking the abs through a sufficient range of motion, but maybe when it comes to like core strength and stability, they may have more of a place. So again, it really does depend on what you're trying to achieve. Please don't sleep on the crunch variations, they're bloody fantastic. That is it, that is a video. If at any point, like I said at the start of the video, you learned something or maybe even liked this video, then please consider liking the video, as 1300 likes is the goal. If you haven't already, please do consider clicking the red button down below to subscribe to the channel, and maybe even the bell next to it so you get notified when I upload every week, twice a week. And if you too have a question you want me to answer at the end of the next video, then please do consider drop it down below in the comment section for comment question of the week, and I shall do so. Thank you for tolerating me. Thank you for tolerating my potentially wasted headpieces. Half of it is bloody out of camera. Look at that. And thank you for tolerating the video.